In 1492, a fellow by the name of Christopher Columbus landed on the shores of North America. When he returned back to Europe, he reported he had found a new land. And on this new land was heathens and savages. I'll buy the word savage, but I'm going to contradict him on the word heathens.
Johnny wanted to go back home. It was 1,000 kilometers away. They forced him to go to the Indian residential school. More than 150,000 of us children had to go. They wanted to change us.
Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name.
Hallowed be your name.
Thy kingdom come,
Thy kingdom come,
thy will be done.
Thy will be done.
Kill the Indian and the child. It's been called cultural genocide. I survived residential school. My brother Johnny did not.
I am the stranger. You can't see me. I am the stranger. Do you know what I mean? I navigate the mud. I walk above the path, jump into the right. Then I jump to the left on a secret path, the one that nobody knows. And I'm moving fast on the path nobody knows.
There have been wounds of injustice, of oppression, of colonization, greed, of superstition, all those things which injure the human heart. At the same time, there's been no way for this to be expressed. It's been held inside. And so this ancestral wound is this wound that's been carried on from generation to generation to generation, this intergenerational trauma.
In the 1870s, the American government separated thousands of indigenous children from their families and forced them into boarding schools.
We bring them in, clean them up, and start them on their way to civilization. Through the agencies of the government, they are being rapidly brought from their state of comparative savagery and barbarism to one of civilization.
The schools banned all forms of indigenous culture and spiritual beliefs, and many children suffered physical, sexual, and emotional abuse from the people who were supposed to be caring for them. Many survivors turned to drugs and alcohol to deal with their pain. The intergenerational effects of this trauma are still felt today.
The amount of intentional lying and deception and keeping parents away from children. So it wasn't like parents were just enrolling these children, they were going to school, and there were some isolated incidents of bad things happening. We're talking about whole-scale theft of children from communities, in large part against the will of the parents, and parents were kept away from those schools, and even children who ran away were brought back oftentimes by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police despite the allegations of what was happening in those schools. And that's the real crime.
You can't see me.
From my experience of why I was at the residential school, my sisters and I were led to believe that our mother was killed in a car accident. But that was not true. She was in the accident, but the ministry and families had taken us, hid me and my sisters for years. When my mom was old enough to care for us again, she searched and searched for us. We were once again reunited. She returned us home as a single parent. And again, it was her struggle that provided us strength to love and respect others. It was then when we returned home that we were brought to the day school again with priests and nuns. So we thought this was the way of life. But we enjoyed where we were, back with our community, family and children that we knew. But the experience here was similar, not again, to use our language, not to use our cultural ways, as that was not for who we were. In my community, it was our mothers who fought for our school and wanted back to teach our language, our culture.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada has concluded that country's decades-long policy of forcibly removing Indigenous children from their families and placing them in state-funded residential Christian schools amounted to, quote, cultural genocide. After a 6-year investigation, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report concluded, quote, the Canadian government pursued this policy of cultural genocide because it wished to divest itself of its legal and financial obligations to Aboriginal people and gain control over their lands and resources. If every Aboriginal person had been absorbed into the body politic, there would be no reserves, no treaties, and no Aboriginal rights.
I am here to verify we were treated like a herd of animals.
Video testimony of some of the thousands of residential school survivors set the tone for this historic day.
The residential school experience is clearly one of the darkest, most troubling chapters in our collective history. In the period from Confederation until the decision to close residential schools was taken in this country in 1969, Canada clearly participated in a period of cultural genocide. We heard of the effects of over 100 years of mistreatment of more than 150,000 First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children placed in these schools. Removed from their families and home communities, 7 generations of Aboriginal children were denied their identity. We heard how, separated from their language, their culture, their spiritual traditions, and their collective history, children became unable to answer questions as simple as, where do I come from? Where am I going? Why am I here? And who am I? But as the survivors have shown us, they have survived.
Taken into a back room, stripped and repeatedly raped throughout the night and sodomized. And the whole time I'm told I'm not right, that I'm an animal.
I really was alone, lonely, scared.
As many as 7,500 Indigenous children died at the residential schools, but the exact figure may never be known. The Canadian government stopped recording the deaths in 1920 after the chief medical officer at Indian Affairs suggested children in the schools were dying at an alarming rate.
What do you think of of this place? Did you like it, or you hate it, or?
Well, I enjoyed it summer because I was sent away to school.
What kind of school?
A boarding school. They tried to teach us to talk English, and we had to wear coveralls. We had to march to school, march to our meals, and then back to
Like
our
for instance,
dormitory.
if they heard you talking Indian, what did they do?
Well, we were punished. We had to do some work, or else they had to wash our mouths with some soap and different things.
Whether or not people agree that this is genocide, it was always against the law to kidnap children, to assault them with deadly weapons, to rape, torture them, use electric chairs on them, to deny them food and water, to beat them to such an extent that some died, to starve them until some died. All of these things were crimes then, just as it is now. And nobody was prosecuted, despite the fact that the RCMP knew, the federal government knew, and the churches knew exactly what was happening. And I think really illustrative of that are the government's own documents. You had doctors coming to the federal government saying, you have extremely high death rates in these schools. And the federal government's response was, well, that doesn't justify a change in our policy because the overall objective is, quote unquote, the final solution. And we've heard those words before. So we know exactly what the intention was. And I know there was a focus on culture and that people were abused and beaten for speaking their language and culture, and they were clearly denied their identity. But for many of these children, upwards of 40%, they were denied their right to live. And that goes far beyond culture. Think about at the same time the forced sterilizations that were happening against Indigenous women and little girls all across the country. Sterilization has nothing to do with one's culture, but in essence, the one's right to continue on in their cultural group or nation-based group. The objective was to get rid of Indians in whatever way possible. Culture was one aspect of it, but also denying them the right to live or to procreate was an essential part of this.
It's historically proven that Indigenous kids were ripped from their families and cleansed of everything that we had. We cut our hair. They beat us when we spoke our language. We weren't allowed to pray. We weren't allowed to wear our clothes. We were not allowed to be who we are.
I watch the stories with the people that went to boarding school. Like I'll get on the internet and just look up stories, and it kind of gave me a lot of answers to why everything was the way it was growing up.
At an institutional level, the churches have a lot more work to do, and they need to make some very specific and targeted apologies and make amends. Because as we know, apology means nothing unless you're going to try to make amends to right the wrongs that happened in the past. And so they have a clear responsibility, in addition to the federal government, to support things like Indigenous languages and cultures and education and trying to find a way to both identify these children and return them to their families and communities. That's incredibly important.
I remember the loneliness, the crying, and being witness to all the abuse around me.
We're here in Portage la Prairie, Indian Residential School. This place was constructed in 1960, and it's been standing for about 100 years. And today we have some residential school survivors that are going to be taking us around this place. Do you remember your first memory here?
We had long hair when we first went into the residential school. Beautiful. I had ringlets, really beautiful ringlets.
But they cut your hair as soon as you
They cut our hair really short.
And I said, what's going on? And I kept asking my sister, what's in Indian? Because I didn't speak English.
The Canadian government created and helped run the residential school system, which was meant to kill the Indian in the child. After being forced to leave their families, many children suffered horrific abuses, such as rape, torture, and even death.
I don't think our parents knew what was happening in those schools. They didn't know the horrors. They didn't know the loneliness, and the deprivation of food, and they didn't know any of that. And we never talked about it. And that wasn't talked about after you went home during the summer. You didn't talk about the beatings. You didn't talk about the being raped or whatever. You didn't talk about those things when you went home during the summer. You just didn't.
We arrived to the dorm in the middle of the night. The supervisor for the junior boys showed me my bed. There were rows of beds where other boys were asleep. I thought they were asleep. But once the supervisor closed the door, all the heads popped up. And the boys all stood around to look at the new kid. That was me. Around the second night or so, the supervisor opened the dorm door, which he caught me sitting up in bed. He says, "We have rules here. If you're caught sitting up in bed, you should be sleeping." Because I was sitting up, I had to be punished. The punishment was getting strapped and whipped with a belt. I believe it was about 7 times that I was whipped in the back.
Everybody in a position of power has long known about the crimes and abuses that happened at residential schools. We're quite thankful for the bravery of the survivors to come forward and make sure that it was documented. This is a critical piece, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission did an incredible job in the face of many barriers put forward by the federal government to make sure that their stories were heard and that as much documented evidence was contained in the report. And I think that's incredibly important for Canadians because we know what happened to us, but Canadians don't know what happened and they don't understand the culpability of the federal government and churches in this regard.
Last year, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police revealed at least 1,181 Native women and girls were killed or went missing between 1980 and 2012. The new Truth and Reconciliation Commission report made a link between the residential schools with the missing and murdered women. The report states, quote, "The available information suggests a devastating link between the large numbers of murdered and missing Aboriginal women and the many harmful background factors in their lives. The complex interplay of factors, many of which are part of the legacy of residential schools, needs to be examined, as does the lack of success of police forces in solving these crimes against Aboriginal women."
This is the basement of the residential school. On this side was where the staff ate.
What kind of foods did they have in here?
They had the best. They had fruit. They had salads and meats. Just the best. But a different story for the residents.
We were used to rabbit, deer meat, and stuff like that. And here it was like the white man's food.
Did you guys ever refuse to eat?
Yes.
Yes, we did.
Oh, yeah.
I had sat beside a young girl one time when she was throwing up because it was really lumpy porridge, and then they hit us like this real hard. And we had to eat her. We still had to eat her vomit. Eating it.
They wanted to destroy our identity, and they put us on these boarding schools. I'm one of them that they put in these boarding schools. You know, destroy, kill the Indian, save the man. And over 100,000 children were taken from their homes and pulled, and a lot in our family, and I'm fighting, where am I going, where am I going? You know, and my mom and my grandma are right there, and I'm trying to hold on to them, and they come and take us apart. And, but that scene was, multiply that by 100,000 children that were taken by force from their mothers and from their grandmas, and grandparents.
You can track the survivors of residential schools to kids in care, to people in prison, to those who are homeless, to those who have poor health. All of these things are very much in the present. So we have to take action now to address the ongoing problems that were started by the residential school and have never stopped and continue to this day in just different terminology and in different policy.
That destroy the language, destroy the songs. As a matter of fact, you couldn't sing any native song. You couldn't speak any native language. The vernacular would be English, and English only. That's how they wrote it up.
In the boarding schools?
Yeah. And there was corporal punishment there. But there was also, I mean, I was in a school where there was priests and nuns. And that was the first one, and I heard the screams. And I was part of the screams. And the running away, and the beatings, and the whippings by belts and leather, and raping. I heard those screams. It just, I hear it today. I said I would never forgive this government for allowing a policy like that to be inflicted upon us. And so historical trauma is still with us.
To be able to go through these places and talk about these memories, does it provide healing for you to be able to do
Every
this?
time it does, yeah. It lessens the pain.
This is hard for me. My mom and dad are both survivors, and a lot of the stories that you say they're echoed, even though she's in Alberta. You know, they just, like, my mom always talks about loneliness.
There's all kinds of pain in this world, right?
Yeah.
There's torture, there's everything. But they say the greatest pain is the loneliness.
Yeah.
To be abandoned. That's what we felt.
And I think what's really important for people around the world to understand is that residential schools didn't stand in isolation. It was in addition to the forced sterilizations, the scalping bounties, all of the overrepresenting our people in prison, stealing them and putting them in child and family services, the thousands of murdered and missing Indigenous women in this country that go unresolved and no steps taken to prevent these actions, and that this is ongoing. It would be a terrible mistake to historicize this and say, well, this happened a long time ago. We now know what happened. Let's apologize and move on. It is ongoing. When they closed residential schools, their very next policy was known as the 60s Scoop, where they actually took more children from First Nations than during the residential school period, which is why we have now 30 to 40% of our children in care. They're still taking our children. They're still trying to raise them in non-Indigenous families. And many of these children end up as murdered and missing Indigenous women, or they end up in the prison system. And this legacy of the residential schools is ongoing. It's very much in the present.
The first schools opened in 1883. The last one closed in 1998. During that time, over 150,000 Indigenous children were sent away to rid them of their native cultures and languages and integrate them into mainstream Canadian society. Many students recall being beaten for speaking their native languages and losing touch with their parents and customs. The report also documents widespread physical, cultural, and sexual abuse at the schools. It was based in part on testimony from 7,000 survivors.
But I don't want to be my story like to be treated as a souvenir, like where you spend time. When you get a souvenir, you spend a lot of time looking for it, and once you get it, you spend a lot of money, and then you show it off to a lot of friends, like what we're doing here. And then after a while, it's going to gather dust and then be put away and forgotten. I don't want that to happen.
I think the Truth and Reconciliation Commission went about as far as they felt comfortable in naming it cultural genocide, but It's just genocide through and through. If you look at the UN definition on genocide, it meets every single one of those factors, and there's nothing cultural about it. They weren't killing us because of our culture. They were killing us because we were Indians, and we stood in the way of accessing all of the lands and resources and settlement in this country. Think about it. All of the overrepresentation in this country in prisons, some prisons have as high as 60% Indigenous peoples. That's not because of our culture. It's because we're Indians and we have rights and Aboriginal rights that still stand in the way of unfettered resource development. Why are our kids overrepresented in child and family services to the tune of 30 to 40,000 in Canada? Here in Manitoba, 90% of all kids in care are Indigenous. It's not because of their culture, it's because of who they are as Indians, and that we're the Indigenous peoples here, and we have rights to protect this territory. And we're essentially the last stand against complete unfettered development here in this country. And so if you look at it across the board, while they may have characterized it in terms of, assimilating culture, you wouldn't have a death rate of upwards of 40% in some of those schools if it was just about culture. It would have been more aggressive education tactics both in those schools and in the communities. If you have a death rate that's higher than those who enlisted in World War II, this wasn't about culture.
Make the space and make room in your hearts and your minds and your spirit. And what I mean by that is to rid yourselves of those racist attitudes, those images of Indigenous peoples as being substandard and pagan and savage. Rid yourself of those racial stereotypes of Indians and Indigenous peoples being dumb and lazy and drunk on welfare. Rid yourself of those things so new things can come in. And the new things to come in are the respect for our languages, our customs, and our traditions, that we are equally as important as human beings.
On a secret path, the one that nobody knows, and I'm moving fast on the path nobody knows.
We must become one. We must walk down a path of reconciliation from now on.